In 1519, Hayreddin Barbarossa controlled Algiers, but not its harbor. A Spanish fortress, the Peñón, still sat on the rock inside the port. Its guns watched every ship that entered. Hayreddin had men, he had ships, he had fear. What he did not have was a state. His brother Aruj was dead, killed near Tlemcen a few months earlier. Local rivals were watching from the hills. The Hafsids in Tunis could offer legitimacy, but not the artillery and soldiers Algiers needed. So Hayreddin made a different calculation. He sent to Sultan Selim I. This episode is about that calculation, how a Corsair base became a vassal state, and why the deal worked when older North African dynasties could not match it. The question is not whether the Barbarossa brothers were pirates, privateers, corsairs, or holy war fighters. 16th century sources use different languages for the same men. The question is narrower and more useful. What turned armed sea power into government? Start with the harbor. Algiers in the early 16th century was not yet the huge fortified capital that later European sources feared. It was a coastal town facing a Spanish-held rock. The Peñón of Algiers sat close enough to dominate the anchorage. Its guns made the harbor a divided place, a Muslim town on shore, a Spanish fortress at the entrance, and every ship entering the water under someone else's range. That geometry mattered more than reputation. A corsair could raid from many ports. A state needed a harbor it could defend, tax, repair, and feed. Spain had spent the years after Granada pushing along the North African coast. Mers el-Kebir was taken in 1505, Oran in 1509, Bougie in 1510. Other towns paid tribute. The pressure was not abstract. It was visible in stone, garrisons, and guns. The Barbarossa brothers entered that world as mobile sea captains with men, ships, and a useful promise. They could fight Spain at sea and on the coast. Aruj, the elder brother, had already made himself a political actor. He was not simply arriving to raid and leave. He was entering towns where local rulers had lost credibility because they could not remove Spanish pressure. The brothers did not replace order with disorder. They sold a stronger form of protection than the local order could provide. In 1516, the notables of Algiers turned toward Aruj. The local ruler, Salim al-Tumi, had a position inside the city and a connection to Spanish power that later sources describe as fatal to his legitimacy. The exact politics are filtered through hostile accounts, but the shape is clear enough. Algiers needed help against the Peñón, and Aruj's armed following made him useful. Then usefulness became sovereignty. Diego de Haedo's 1612 Topographia, a Spanish account built from captive testimony and anti-Ottoman assumptions, gives the most vivid version of the takeover. In Haedo, Aruj lodges in the same house as Salim al-Tumi. Salim enters the bath. Aruj enters after him and has him strangled. The death is then presented as an accident until Aruj's men move through the city and proclaim him ruler. That is a source we can use, but not casually. Haedo writes almost a century later from a Christian captive tradition, and his language is hostile. The bath murder may be true. It may also be shaped as a moral tale about treachery. What is harder to dismiss is the political outcome. Salim disappears from power, Aruj is proclaimed, coins and fortification follow, and Algiers is no longer ruled as it had been. Aruj's first problem was that taking Algiers did not remove Spain from Algiers. The Peñón remained. In 1516, a Spanish expedition under Diego de Vera tried to restore control and failed. That failure strengthened Aruj's position because it made the city see the immediate advantage of his violence. The old ruler had not removed the fortress. Aruj, at least, could defeat the army sent from across the water. But a city, Hayreddin could not make Algiers safe by declaring himself strong. He needed an outside patron with enough force to change the calculation inside the city and enough religious political authority to make his rule less provisional. The Hafsids could offer a familiar regional frame. They could not put janissaries and Ottoman artillery into Algiers at the required scale. The Ottomans could. So in late 1519, Hayreddin sent an embassy to Salim I's Christine Isom-Verhaaren's reading of the Ottoman material is precise on this point. Hayreddin's control in Algiers was tenuous. In November 1519, he dispatched an embassy requesting assistance. Salim responded with 2,000 janissaries and artillery, which arrived in September 1520. After that assistance, Hayreddin placed the Sultan's name on coins and had the khutba, the Friday sermon, read in the Sultan's name. Coins in the khutba were not decoration. If your name is on the coin, every market transaction in the city has to admit your authority before money can change hands. If your name is in the Friday prayer, every congregation in the city hears whose sovereignty is being named aloud. Together with soldiers and guns, those two acts turn a personal command into a public political settlement. Hayreddin's deal with Salim did three things at once. It gave Algiers troops. It gave Hayreddin legitimacy. It gave the Ottoman Empire a Western Mediterranean frontier without conquering the city directly. That last point is easy to miss if we treat empire as a colored block on a map. Algiers was not absorbed like a nearby province after a land campaign. It joined the Ottoman sphere through a frontier bargain. The Corsair brought the harbor and the war. The Sultan brought recognition, men, artillery, and a name that could be spoken from the pulpit. This is what piracy becoming a state looks like in the documents. Not romance, not a flag. Not a single dramatic raid. A ruler who cannot hold a city alone asks a distant empire to make his power public. There is a myth-verse-record problem here, but it is not the usual Johnson problem. Johnson's 1724 pirate history is almost irrelevant to the founding of Algiers. The myth layer comes from another habit. European sources often collapse the whole case into the image of the Muslim pirate menace, while later nationalist or heroic tellings flatten the brothers into founders without the coercion. The records say something more difficult. Haedo's account gives a violent seizure in a coerced city. Ottoman-connected scholarship preserves a language of Gaza, frontier service, and imperial recognition. Modern historians, such as Andrew Hess and Emre Safa-Gürkan, read the same frontier as a place where Habsburg and Ottoman strategy met local Corsair power. The legend says pirate terror or heroic foundation. The records say a bargain built from fear, protection, artillery, coins, Friday prayer, and a harbor Spain had failed to neutralize. The Peñón remained the unfinished part of the arrangement. Even after the Ottoman connection, Spanish guns still sat inside the harbor. The new political form had a visible contradiction at its center. Algiers could name the Ottoman Sultan in prayer, but its anchorage was still watched by a Spanish fortress. Hayreddin was forced out of Algiers for a time after local and regional pressure rose against him. Ottoman backing did not solve everything at once. But when he returned, he was not only a Corsair captain trying to hold a town. He was the Ottoman-linked ruler of a frontier base that both sides of the Mediterranean now had to treat as more than a pirate nest. In 1529, the contradiction was removed. Hayreddin captured the Peñón and used its stone and position to transform the harbor. Later, Algiers would be remembered as a Corsair capital, but the practical foundation was older and colder. Without a usable, protected port, Corsair war could not become durable government. Look at the chain. Spanish expansion created the need for armed protection. Local invitation opened the door. Aruj's seizure turned protection into rule. His death exposed how fragile that rule was. Hayreddin's submission to Salim traded autonomy for recognition and reinforcement. Coins, khutba, janissaries, and artillery changed the political grammar of the city. The capture of the Peñón later completed the harbor logic the brothers had been trying to solve since 1516. The best Ottoman-connected narrative for this world is the Gazavat-i Hayreddin Pasha, written by Sayyid Muradi in the 16th century. It is not a neutral archive file. It belongs to the Gazavat name tradition, a form that praises frontier war and turns a commander's campaigns into exemplary action. Aldo Galata's study of the manuscript tradition makes that double character plain. The work stands between history and heroic narrative, yet it remains one of the most important sources for Hayreddin's career. That double character is useful if we handle it honestly. The Gazavat helps us understand how Hayreddin's circle wanted the career read, not as criminal drifting, but as service, Gaza, and eventual recognition by the ruler of Rum. Haedo helps us see how Spanish and captive Christian memory wanted the same career read: treachery, seizure, danger to Christendom. Neither voice is the whole record. Put together, they show the conversion itself. The same man who appears as Barbarossa in a Spanish hostel account appears in Ottoman memory as a frontier servant whose armed following could be folded into imperial war. This also changes how we read the word Corsair. In much European writing, Corsair is just pirate with a political excuse. In Ottoman and Maghrebi contexts, the category is less simple. These men could be sea raiders, religious warriors, naval contractors, governors, and imperial servants at different moments in the same career. The same action could be called piracy by one archive and frontier war by another. That does not make the violence disappear. Captives were taken, coastal communities paid, ships were seized. But it does stop the lazy explanation that piracy sat outside the state until the state crushed it. In Algiers, the state grew by incorporating the very men who made violence at sea profitable. This is why the Hafsid option mattered. A regional dynasty could claim familiarity and Islamic legitimacy, but by the early 16th century, its ability to answer Spain on the central Maghrebi coast was limited. Hayreddin needed a patron whose enemies matched his enemies and whose military resources could arrive by sea. The Ottoman-Habsburg conflict made Algiers useful to Istanbul at the same moment Istanbul became useful to Algiers. A frontier bargain works only when both sides need something. The Sultan did not acquire Algiers as a charity case. He acquired a western base against Habsburg Spain, access to experienced seamen, and a way to project power beyond the normal reach of Ottoman administration. Hayreddin did not submit from piety alone. He gained soldiers, artillery, titles, and a larger name under which local obedience could be demanded. The result was not a normal province. It was a vassal arrangement with room for local force. That room is the point. Algiers could be Ottoman enough to receive recognition and troops, but local enough for Corsair captains and military elites to keep shaping its politics. That tension would define the regency for centuries. The documents do not give us a clean founding charter in the modern sense. They give us something better for this case. The working parts of power, the embassy to Salim, the 2,000 janissaries, the artillery, the coins, the khutba, the Spanish fortress still in the harbor, the later removal of that fortress. Those parts explain the state more clearly than a heroic portrait does. Algiers did not become a regency because Hayreddin was the most dramatic sailor in the Mediterranean. It became a regency because he solved a problem that a raider alone could not solve: how to make armed sea power obeyable on land. The case did not begin with the Ottoman flag. It began with a harbor under Spanish guns and a city searching for protection. The state that emerged was neither simple piracy nor simple empire. It was the bargain between them, written in soldiers, coins, prayer, and stone.